All right, so you've gone out and you've collected your seed, and now you want to process the seed, clean it, remove it from the fruit or the pulp. Whether you're going to plant it directly or go store it, this is oftentimes a necessary step. And so I just want to talk about some of my, thoughts and considerations when it comes to cleaning and processing seed. Real quick, first off, there's a few reasons why you may want to process the seed. For certain species, if you do not remove the seed from the flesh of the fruit, there's a chance of the seed rotting inside of the fruit. So, examples of this, I've heard of some people having issues with hickories rotting if you don't remove the husk. Not all species of hickories, but some species of hickories seem susceptible to this. I've also heard of this issue with things like spice bush, right? Getting the seed separated from the pulp can be important in that species, apparently. Some species don't care. Persimmon, pawpaw, black walnut, you could not process those at all. You could just plant a whole fruit in the ground. You could plant a whole walnut inside of the husk. And very likely that husk and that fruit will just decay over the wintertime and the seed will germinate in the spring. So it's not always necessary, but sometimes it's necessary for the survival of the seed. It's oftentimes very useful to clean and process the seed so that you can examine the seed and look at, look for mold, look for shriveled up seeds, that sort of thing. If you're going to float test your seed, you can't float test them if they're inside of a fruit or inside of a husk. I talked about float testing a little bit in the last video and why you might do that. Basically, putting the seeds in water and most viable seeds will sink. It's not always the rule, but most viable seeds will sink and oftentimes the bad seeds will float. So you may have to process in order to float test if that's something you want to do. It's also, if you're storing your seeds, processing them or cleaning them, whatever verbiage you want to use, allows you to utilize less space, right? So a black walnut in a husk takes up more space than a black walnut out of a husk. Same for like persimmon seeds, free of the persimmon fruit, take up a lot less space than a bunch of persimmon fruit. So if you're storing the seeds, this can really help you save on space. So those are some basic reasons why you might want to do this. Regardless, if you decide that you're going to do this part, there's lots of different ways to go about cleaning your seed. This is going to be by no means a comprehensive list, but these are some of my favorite methods, things that I use, and you can kind of take some of this and iterate on your own and just try stuff out. All right, so the way I look at it, there's basically 3 different types of seed that you may be processing or cleaning. There's seed that comes inside of a fruit, okay, oftentimes called wet seed. There's seed that is dry. Oftentimes this comes in a seed pod, similar to beans, a dry pod. And there's nuts, which are kind of somewhere in between. Some nuts are kind of more classified like a wet seed. Some I would classify more as like a dry seed. So wet seed, fruits, dry seed, pods, and then nuts somewhere in the middle. And the way that you process them all is kind of similar. There's definitely some similarities across all the different types, but it's easy to kind of classify. I think it's useful to kind of classify them and think about them in different ways. Think about processing each type in a slightly different way, different methods. All right, so the first method, and this really applies mostly to fruits, although actually I guess this could also apply to nuts that are in the husk, which is basically you can just remove the fruit by hand. So you can see with this pawpaw here, I'm cutting into it to cut the fruit in half, and then I'm basically just using utensils and my hands to kind of scoop out the seeds, scoop out the flesh, and remove this, sort out the skin. And so this is really useful if you have a small amount of seeds, or if you want to use, maybe you want the seeds for growing, but you want the fruit for consuming. Since we're having such control over this with our hands and we're using clean utensils and whatnot, using that method, I can save the pulp from the fruit and use it for culinary purposes and put the seeds aside. Now, a different method here, you can see me with the spice bush. I'm kind of mashing the berries, the spice bush berries, through a screen. So a lot of seed saving is accomplished with the help of screens of varying sizes. So this 1/4-inch hardware cloth screen for spice bush happens to be very effectively sized that most of the seeds will fall right through the hardware cloth and the pulp is kind of caught and sorted out by the hardware cloth. You can see it's not 100%. This is not the best method. This is just kind of something I was experimenting with, but it's a good example of being able to use screens that are either just the right size for the seeds to pass through and other stuff not to pass through, or you can sometimes use the opposite, where you want the screen to be catching all of the seeds and allowing finer particles to fall through, depending on what you're trying to clean, what stage of a project you're at. Screens can be very, very useful. Now, for that screen method to work, it really helps if the fruit is somewhat rotted and mashed up. Those spice bush I was processing the fruit had started to rot. They had been sitting around for a little while. Here you can see I'm using grapes that have been mashed up. These grapes were actually mashed up by a cidery that was making a wine, and they gave me some of the waste product, which had a lot of the pulp, or the skin rather, and the seeds already nice and mashed up. And I'm kind of trying the screen method again, which is not my favorite method, but it does work. Now you can see me throwing some of that material there on the side. Oftentimes, some of our waste products from seed saving have seeds left in them. So I think it's very valuable to take this product or this material, as you can see me messing with it here, and putting it somewhere where if there are any seeds, they have a chance to grow, okay? I like processing my seeds outside in a place where the seeds may grow. So now let's talk about, for wet seeds, for fruits, a method that works really well, which is what you can see here, soaking and decanting. So this works really well for any seed that comes inside of a fruit. This color of this liquid here is actually pokeberry, very cool color. And so the goal is to mash up the fruit in water, okay? And this is just pokeberries and water that we're looking at in this specific example. And all of the seeds, similar to the float test, all of the seeds should sink, and a lot of the pulp and other material should float. And so if you mix it all up really good and then start pouring some of that water off of the top very slowly, this is called decanting. You'll pour off all of the junk that you don't want. It's not really junk, but all of the stuff that's not seed material. It's valuable organic matter. You'll pour all of that off slowly, and you'll be left with all the seeds at the bottom. Now, often you'll have to basically you'll pour most of the water off, and you'll have to add clean water in again and mix it up, and then pour that water off. You'll have to repeat this many times to get the seeds super clean. Sometimes you can use screens, can be helpful to catch some of the debris. Like if you find that a lot of the seeds are spilling out, you can try to catch some of the material with screens of different sizes depending on your goals. It's also helpful, as you can see here, there's some ways to mash up the fruit. You can mash them up with your feet, with your hands, with a 2x4. You can use a drill with a paint mixer. You can use a little stick inside of a jar. These are some nightshade berries. There's all sorts of ways to basically just mash up the fruit and then add in some water. If you've ever saved tomato seeds, I believe these are asparagus seeds we're looking at, but a lot of people, who garden may have experimented with saving their own tomato seeds, for example. It's the same process, really, as saving tomato seeds. And you can see here's a really good example of, decanting, pouring off that plant material and debris, and you wind up catching all the seeds at the bottom. You can see there's all the seeds there. And this is a good example of there were some seeds pouring off the top that were floating. They're probably not viable, but we don't really know because the float test is never 100% accurate. So all of that material with the floated seeds will get spread out into the garden or into a compost pile. So that, again, if any of those seeds are viable, they might have a chance to volunteer. It's just something I like to do. All right, so let's pivot and talk about our dry-seeded crops, such as this redbud we're looking at here. Typically, they come in dry pods or seed heads. You can just pick each pod or seed head apart by hand, one by one. Or, there are methods to do this at a larger scale. And so now we're looking at some black locust seeds that I've started to process. I haven't finished processing this batch. I find that the best way to handle the dry-seeded crops, if you have a lot of them and you don't want to do it by hand, is just to take all of the pods and you just want to bash them up in some sort of container. So whether that means putting them in a bag and smacking them around with a stick or against a wall, or whether that means putting them in a big blue Tupperware or out on a tarp and stomping on them like you're stomping grapes for wine, just, really beat them up. You find some way to beat them up, basically beat up the pods, and this should hopefully release most of the seeds from the pod material, and then you'll have to separate the seeds from the pods. And so the way that is done, it's called winnowing, and often fans are used. You're going to take all of the material and let it fall. I'll try to insert some footage here. basically let it free fall in front of a fan, and the fan should blow most of the organic matter, the pod material away, and the seeds should be heavy enough to fall into some sort of collection device. You can see here I'm picking hazelnuts by hand. I don't have a good way for processing hazelnuts at scale, to be honest with you all. I have been doing this by hand. I find that's the best way for hazelnuts. But for some of the, locust and red buds and things, you can totally beat them up. Treat them like beans. If you've ever harvested dry beans for seed, kind of treat them like that. And just know that each specific plant has slightly different susceptibility to damage. So certain seeds are really hard and you can really stomp on them with all of your might. Other seeds are a little bit more fragile and you have to be a little bit gentle as you beat up the pods. All right, so this footage is not tree seed, it's actually kale seed, but it's a good demonstration of winnowing. You can see there's still a little bit of plant material left in there, and I am pouring the seed out. I'm actually using the wind instead of a fan, and a lot of that debris is getting blown out and the seeds are all being collected in the bowl below me. You can also use screens. If you can find the right size of screen, they can really help you out. So like here, for example, you can see all the pods are much larger than the individual seeds. So I happen to have a screen that had holes big enough that that the seeds could fall through, and most of that chaff plant material could not. And so instead of having to deal with the wind, I could just pour all that material through the screen, and what I would be left with is mostly seeds in one pile and mostly chaff inside of the screen. So you can see here, we just put some in, we shake it a little bit, the seeds fall through, and we're left with just the plant pods, which again, I'm going to use as mulch, scatter it out somewhere where if there are any seeds left, it can still germinate. But this is a really good way to clean and process dry seed, is either winnowing or screens or some combination. All right, so now let's talk about nuts. And we're really talking about nuts with husks in this part. So like black walnuts, hickory nuts, pecans, things that have a husk. So how do you get that husk off? If we're talking about other nuts like acorns or chestnuts or hazelnuts, they're kind of more dry. You don't have to remove their thin outer shell as long as you get like the chestnuts out of the burr or the hazelnuts out of their little pod or burr. Acorns just kind of fall off the tree when they're ripe. You don't have to do any further processing to any of those. But if you have the walnuts and hickories, things with husks, you got to get the husk off. And what you're looking at here is my preferred method as of right now, which is to use a paint mixer on a drill and a bucket of water. I find that this works really well for a large quantity of nuts. You do want to use a corded, really heavy-duty drill. You don't want to use a little battery-powered drill like I have there. This process beats the snot out of battery-powered drills. You want something heavy-duty. I also don't think that mortar mixers work great for this. I think paint mixer is the right size bit for a 5-gallon bucket. I think you don't want a mixer that's any bigger than what you just saw there. Another really important note that I found, especially with black walnuts, is that, the husks, when they fall off the tree, they can sometimes be kind of firm. Sometimes they're kind of soft when they fall off the tree. But if they have a little bit of time on the ground where there's some moisture, the husks will start to rot. And at that stage, they are really, really easy to process this way. I mean, you can just grab a nut like I'm grabbing here, and the husk just disintegrates and falls off. If the walnuts start to dry out, if you have some really dry weather, if you pick them and store them somewhere where they have a chance to dry a little bit, that husk can harden and become really attached to the shell and hard to get off. So give some consideration to timing when you're trying to get the husks off your walnuts. You want to get them when they're as rotten as possible and don't let them dry out. Now there's a lot of other ways to go about removing the husks. You can see I'm literally just doing it with my hand here. I know a lot of people with walnuts love to run them over with their car. That's totally valid. You can cut the husk with a knife and then just kind of rip it off. There's a whole lot of ways. I mean, I've seen people online basically turn old lime spreaders into walnut hullers and things of that nature. Pretty much all these methods will also work for hickories and pecans, getting the husk off. The husks are a little bit different on nuts like hickories and pecans. They kind of come off in segments typically as long as they're ripe. And so that can be easy by hand, but you can totally put them in the bucket with the mixer like this too. So this is live footage of me realizing that this passion flower fruit was not ripe and did not have ripe seeds yet.